I was standing in my kitchen at 72 years old, staring at an empty bank statement that should have shown $47,000 in savings, when I realized my own son had stolen everything I'd worked for my entire life. What started as helping with wedding expenses became the most devastating betrayal I could imagine. But what my son David didn't know was that this grandmother wasn't going down without a fight, and I was about to teach him a lesson about respect that would change our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've lived in the same house in Scottsdale, Arizona for 38 years, ever since my late husband Frank and I bought it as newlyweds back in 1985. Frank passed away 7 years ago from cancer, leaving me with this beautiful 3-bedroom ranch house, a small pension from his years as a mechanic, and the savings we'd carefully built together over 4 decades of marriage. I'm not your typical grandmother. Sure, I bake cookies for my grandkids and keep photos of them covering my refrigerator, but I also spent 35 years as a registered nurse in the emergency room at Phoenix General Hospital. I've seen every kind of human drama you can imagine, dealt with life and death situations on a daily basis, and learned how to stay calm under pressure. After Frank died, I thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. The house Frank and I bought together sits on a quiet street, lined with palm trees and desert landscaping. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine. The mortgage was paid off 15 years ago, and every month I'd been adding to our savings account, planning for the day when I might need assisted living or medical care. Frank and I had been careful with money our whole lives. We drove used cars, took modest vacations, and always lived below our means. By the time I turned 72, I had managed to save $47,000 beyond what I needed for monthly expenses. I have 3 children. Linda, my oldest at 48, is a high school teacher in Flagstaff with 2 teenage daughters. She inherited her father's practical nature and has always been responsible with money. Robert, my youngest at 42, works as a computer programmer in Denver and visits twice a year with his wife and twin boys. He's quiet, but dependable, just like Frank was. Then there's David, my middle child at 45. David has always been different from his siblings. Where Linda and Robert are steady and reliable, David is charming and impulsive. He's worked a dozen different jobs over the years, from selling insurance to running a food truck to trying his hand at real estate. Nothing ever seems to stick. He's also been married twice before, both times to women who eventually got tired of his financial instability and empty promises. 6 months ago, David showed up at my door with Ashley, his latest girlfriend. Ashley is 28, 17 years younger than David, with long blonde hair and a sweet smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. She works as a dental hygienist and seems nice enough, though I notice she has expensive tastes for someone making a modest salary. Her purse cost more than I spend on groceries in a month, and she drives a brand new BMW that she's constantly making payments on. David announced they were engaged and planning a wedding for the following spring. He seemed happier than I'd seen him in years, talking about how Ashley was the one and how this time everything would be different. They wanted a big wedding, he explained, something elegant and memorable. Ashley had always dreamed of a fairy tale ceremony, and David was determined to give it to her. "We're thinking about the Phoenician resort," Ashley said during that first dinner, her eyes sparkling as she described her vision. "You know, the one up on Camelback Mountain with the amazing views. They have this gorgeous garden area for outdoor ceremonies." I nearly choked on my iced tea. The Phoenician is one of the most expensive venues in Arizona. I'd driven past it countless times over the years, marveling at the luxury cars in the parking lot and the immaculate grounds. It's the kind of place where celebrities and wealthy business people hold their events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said carefully, "but those places can be quite expensive." David waved off my concern with the same casual gesture he'd used since childhood when he didn't want to hear about practical matters. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We've got it figured out." Ashley's parents are contributing and I've been saving up. This surprised me, since David had never been much of a saver. Just 2 years earlier, I'd helped him out with 3 months of rent when his real estate venture collapsed. But maybe Ashley's influence was helping him become more responsible. I wanted to believe that this time would be different. Over the next few months, David and Ashley became regular visitors to my house. They'd stop by every weekend, sometimes bringing wedding magazines to show me different ideas for flowers, decorations, and dresses. Ashley had chosen a gown that cost $3,000, more than I'd spent on all 3 of my children's school clothes combined in any given year. She talked about hiring a photographer who charged $5,000 for the day, and a caterer who specialized in what she called elevated comfort food. I listened to their plans with growing concern, but tried to keep my opinions to myself. It wasn't my money, and it wasn't my wedding. If they wanted to start their marriage with massive debt, that was their choice. I'd learned over the years that trying to control adult children usually backfires. But then David started asking for small favors. Could I pay for the engagement party since they were running short on cash? The party only cost $800, which seemed reasonable for a celebration. Could I help with the deposit for the wedding cake? The baker required $500 up front, and David's latest paycheck had been smaller than expected. Each request was accompanied by promises that he'd pay me back as soon as his commission check came in, or as soon as Ashley's promotion went through. I said yes to these requests because they seemed modest, and because I wanted to support David's happiness. After 2 failed marriages, he deserved a chance at lasting love. Besides, I had the money sitting in my savings account, earning almost nothing in interest. If I could help my son start his marriage on solid ground, wasn't that what mothers were supposed to do? The requests gradually became larger and more frequent. Could I cover the flowers since the florist demanded payment in advance? That was $1,200. Could I help with the rehearsal dinner since Ashley's parents had already contributed so much? Another $1,500. Each time, David assured me these were loans, not gifts, and each time he seemed genuinely grateful for my help. "You're the best mom in the world," he'd say, giving me the same charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. "I promise I'll pay you back as soon as we get settled after the honeymoon." I kept careful records of every payment, writing down the amount and the date in a small notebook I kept in my kitchen drawer. By December, 6 months before the wedding, I had loaned David nearly $8,000. It was more money than I'd ever given to any of my children at once, but I rationalized it as an investment in his future happiness. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in January. I had gone to the bank to make my monthly deposit from my pension check when the teller handed me my balance receipt. I stared at the number, certain there had been a mistake. My savings account, which should have shown $39,000 after my recent loans to David, showed only $412. "There must be an error," I told the teller, my voice shaking. "This can't be right." The young woman, whose name tag read Jennifer, looked at my account on her computer screen. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but the balance is correct." There have been several large withdrawals over the past few months. My hands were trembling as she printed out a detailed statement. Transaction after transaction showed withdrawals of $3,000, $5,000, even $8,000 at a time. All of them were electronic transfers, and all of them were authorized by someone with access to my account information. I drove home in a daze, the bank statement lying on the passenger seat like evidence of a crime. How was this possible? I was careful with my banking information. I never gave my PIN number to anyone. I didn't even do online banking because I didn't trust computers with my financial information. Then I remembered the morning 3 months ago when David had offered to help me set up online access to my account. "It's so much more convenient, Mom," he'd said. "You can check your balance anytime without having to drive to the bank." He'd sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, walking me through the process of creating a username and password. I'd been grateful for his help, since technology has never been my strong suit. That evening, I called David and asked him to come over. I needed to understand what had happened to my money, and I was praying there was some innocent explanation. Maybe there had been a banking error, or maybe someone had stolen my information and David could help me figure out how to get my money back. David arrived an hour later, alone. Ashley was working late, he explained. but she sent her love. He seemed relaxed and cheerful, asking about my day and commenting on how good the house smelled. I'd been baking banana bread earlier, a nervous habit I'd developed since Frank died. "David," I said, sitting down across from him at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many meals over the years. "I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." His expression shifted slightly, the casual smile fading into something more guarded. "Sure, Mom, what's going on?" I placed the bank statement on the table between us. "Someone has been taking money from my savings account. A lot of money, nearly all of it." David picked up the statement and studied it, his face a mask of concern and confusion. "This is terrible, Mom. Have you called the bank? This looks like identity theft. You need to report this right away." The sincerity in his voice almost made me doubt my suspicions. Almost. But I'd been a nurse for 35 years, and I'd learned how to read people. David was lying and he was good at it, but not good enough to fool his mother. "David," I said quietly, "you're the only person who has access to my account information. You helped me set up the online banking." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. David set down the statement and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but resignation. Like a poker player who'd been caught bluffing and knew the game was over. "Mom, I can explain," he said finally. "Then explain." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd made since childhood when he was about to confess to something. The wedding costs got out of control. Ashley's parents pulled out of contributing at the last minute because her dad lost his job. The venue required the full payment up front, and we'd already put deposits down on everything else. I was going to pay you back before you noticed. "Before I noticed that you stole $46,000 from me?" "I didn't steal it," David said, his voice rising defensively. "I borrowed it. There's a difference. Borrowing requires permission, David. This is theft." He stood up and began pacing around my kitchen, the same way he used to when he was a teenager, trying to talk his way out of trouble. "Mom, you don't understand. This wedding is everything to Ashley. It's her dream. Her first marriage was a courthouse ceremony with a guy who didn't care about making it special. This is her chance to have the wedding she's always wanted." I stared at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported, through every failure and disappointment of his adult life. "And what about my dreams, David? What about my security? That money was supposed to take care of me when I get old and sick." "You're not going to get old and sick," he said dismissively. "You're healthy as a horse. You'll probably live to be 90. And, besides, the house is worth way more than what I took. You've got plenty of equity." The casual way he dismissed my concerns, the assumption that my financial security was less important than his girlfriend's wedding fantasies, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't the son I'd raised. This was a stranger who happened to share my last name. "I want my money back," I said firmly. David stopped pacing and turned to face me. "Mom, I told you. I'll pay you back. But I can't do it right now. Everything we have is tied up in the wedding. Maybe after the honeymoon, when Ashley gets that promotion she's expecting, we can work out a payment plan." "I don't want a payment plan, David. I want my money back now." "That's not realistic," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought someone was being unreasonable. "The wedding is in 4 months. We can't cancel everything now. Do you know how much money we'd lose in deposits?" I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. "You're going ahead with the wedding? Using money you stole from me?" "I borrowed it, and yes, we're going ahead. Ashley doesn't know where the money came from, and I don't want her to. She thinks her parents came through with their contribution after all. If you make a big deal about this now, you'll ruin everything." The audacity of it took my breath away. He had stolen my life savings, and now he was asking me to keep quiet about it to protect his girlfriend's feelings. He was expecting me to smile and attend his wedding, knowing that every flower, every bite of food, every moment of celebration was paid for, with money that should have been securing my future. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, don't be dramatic, we can work this out." "Get out of my house." David's expression hardened. "Fine. But think about what you're doing here, Mom. Do you really want to destroy your relationship with your son over money? Family is supposed to be more important than that. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the bank statement and feeling like my world had collapsed around me. The son I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed for and worried about and loved unconditionally, had stolen from me without a moment's hesitation. And when confronted, he'd shown no remorse, no shame, only irritation, that I wasn't willing to quietly accept his betrayal. That night, I called my daughter Linda in Flagstaff. I needed to talk to someone who would understand the magnitude of what had happened, someone who could help me figure out what to do next. "Mom, are you sure?" Linda asked after I'd explained everything. "I mean, I know David can be irresponsible, but theft? That's a felony." "I'm sure," I said. "I have the bank records." He admitted it. Linda was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" It was a good question. What was I going to do? I could report the theft to the police, but David was right about one thing. He was my son. Did I really want to send him to prison? I could demand he cancel the wedding and return whatever money he could, but he'd made it clear that wasn't going to happen. I could cut him out of my life entirely, but that would mean losing my relationship with him forever. Or I could find another way to get justice. A way that would teach David a lesson about consequences while protecting my own future security. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind rattle my windows, an idea began to form in my mind. It was bold, it was risky, and it would probably shock everyone who knew me. But sometimes, when someone steals everything you've worked for, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes to get it back. The morning after David left my house, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. For too long, I'd been reacting to other people's choices, letting my son make decisions about my money and my future. That was about to change. I made my coffee extra strong and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind I'd used for 35 years to keep track of patient information in the emergency room. At the top of the page, I wrote Operation Recovery in my neat nurse's handwriting. If David thought he could steal from me and face no consequences, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The first call I made was to my friend Carol Martinez, who lived 3 streets over in a house almost identical to mine. Carol and I had worked together at Phoenix General for 20 years before she retired 5 years ago to take care of her ailing mother. She was the kind of woman who didn't take nonsense from anyone, whether it was drunk patients in the ER or incompetent doctors who thought they knew better than experienced nurses. "Maggie, honey, I was just thinking about you," Carol said when she answered the phone. "How are you holding up with all this wedding?" "Nonsense?" I told Carol bits and pieces about David's expensive plans, but I hadn't shared the full extent of what had happened. Now I laid it all out for her, from the first small requests for money to yesterday's devastating discovery at the bank. Carol listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval that grew louder as the story progressed. "That little bastard," she said when I finished. "Excuse my language, but Maggie, that's exactly what he is. I never liked David, you know that. Too smooth, too charming. Men like that always think the world owes them something." Carol had never been shy about sharing her opinions of my children. She adored Linda and Robert, but she'd always been suspicious of David's motives. More than once over the years, she'd suggested that I was enabling his irresponsible behavior by bailing him out of financial trouble. "You were right," I admitted. "I should have listened to you years ago." "Well, crying over spilled milk won't get your money back," Carol said pragmatically. "What are you going to do about it?" I explained the idea that had been forming in my mind since the previous evening. Carol was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear her considering all the angles. "That's brilliant," she said finally. "Absolutely brilliant. And completely legal, which is the best part. When do we start?" The fact that Carol immediately said we, instead of you, reminded me why our friendship had lasted so long. She was the kind of person who showed up when you needed her, no questions asked. My next call was to Janet Morrison, the lawyer who had handled Frank's estate when he died. Janet was a small, fierce woman in her 60s who specialized in family law and estate planning. She'd guided me through the complicated process of transferring Frank's assets and updating my will, and I trusted her completely. "Mrs. Thompson, how nice to hear from you," Janet said when her secretary put me through. "I hope everything is well." "Actually, Janet, I need some legal advice about a family matter." I explained the situation as clearly and objectively as I could, sticking to the facts and avoiding emotional commentary. Janet listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts. "I see," she said when I finished. "And you're certain your son had unauthorized access to your account?" "Completely certain. I have all the bank records, and he admitted to taking the money." "Have you considered filing a police report? This is clearly theft, regardless of your family relationship." I'd been wrestling with this question all night. I don't want to send my son to prison, Janet, but I also can't let him get away with stealing my life savings. "I understand. Family situations are always complicated. Tell me, have you considered other options for recovering your losses?" This was where my plan came in. "Actually, yes. I have an idea, but I need to know if it's legal." I outlined my strategy in detail, watching Janet's expression carefully for any sign that I was about to suggest something illegal or unethical. Instead, I saw her eyebrows rise with what looked like professional admiration. "Mrs. Thompson, that's quite clever. And yes, it's completely legal. In fact, it's exactly what I would recommend to any client in your situation. You're well within your rights to take that action. Even without warning David first? You have no legal obligation to warn someone who has stolen from you. In fact, given his response when you confronted him yesterday, I'd say advance warning would be counterproductive." Janet agreed to handle the paperwork for me, and we scheduled an appointment for the following morning. She also recommended that I document everything David had taken, including dates and amounts, in case I needed to pursue criminal charges later. That afternoon, Carol came over to help me go through my financial records. We spread everything out on my dining room table: bank statements, canceled checks, receipts from all the wedding expenses I'd paid for, and my careful handwritten notes about each loan David had requested. $46,873, Carol said, adding up the final total. "That son of a gun took almost $47,000 from you." Seeing it written down in black and white made the theft feel even more real. That money represented years of careful saving, of choosing the store-brand groceries over name brands, of skipping vacations and driving my old Honda instead of buying something newer. Frank and I had sacrificed for decades to build that nest egg, and David had blown through it in 6 months to impress a woman who didn't even know where the money was coming from. "The worst part," I told Carol, "is that he doesn't see anything wrong with it. He actually seemed annoyed that I was upset." Carol shook her head in disgust. "That's what happens when you raise kids to believe they're entitled to everything they want. Not that you did that intentionally, honey, but David's been skating by on charm and good looks his whole life. Nobody ever made him face real consequences." She was right. David's first wife had supported him through 2 failed business ventures. His second wife had paid for his expensive hobbies and bailed him out when his schemes collapsed. I'd covered his rent, his car payments, and his credit card bills more times than I could count. He'd learned that if he smiled and made promises, someone would always rescue him from his poor choices. "Well, the free ride ends now," I said firmly. The next morning I dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought for Frank's funeral, and drove to Janet's office in downtown Scottsdale. The legal district was all glass buildings and palm trees, a far cry from the modest neighborhood where I'd spent most of my working life. Janet's office was professional but warm, with family photos on her desk and diplomas covering one wall. She'd prepared all the necessary paperwork, and she walked me through each document carefully, explaining what everything meant and what would happen next. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" she asked as I signed the final page. "Once we file these papers, there's no taking it back." I thought about David's face when he dismissed my concerns about my financial security. I thought about his casual assumption that my money was his to take. I thought about Ashley's expensive dress and the fairy tale wedding that was being funded with my stolen savings. I'm certain, I said, signing my name with a firm hand. All right then, I'll file these papers this afternoon. The process will take about 2 weeks to complete, and then you'll need to give him the required 30-day notice. And he can't contest it? He can try, but he won't have any legal standing. You own the property free and clear, and you have the right to determine who lives there. That evening, I called Linda to update her on my plans. She listened in stunned silence as I explained what I was about to do. Mom, are you sure this is the right approach? I mean, I know David was wrong to take your money, but this seems pretty drastic. Linda, your brother stole nearly $50,000 from me and then told me I was being unreasonable to expect it back. How exactly would you handle that situation? Linda was quiet for a moment. I guess I don't know. It's just such a mess. Yes, it is. A mess that David created when he decided my life savings were his to spend. What about the wedding? If you do this, there's no way David can afford to go through with it. That was exactly the point, though I didn't say so to Linda. If David couldn't afford his extravagant wedding without stealing from me, then maybe he shouldn't be having an extravagant wedding. That's David's problem to solve, I said instead. I can't be responsible for fixing messes he created by stealing from me. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into preparing for what was coming. Carol helped me research storage facilities where David could keep his belongings temporarily. I contacted a locksmith about changing all the locks on my house. I even bought a small security camera for my front porch, just in case David's reaction was worse than I anticipated. The hardest part was acting normal when David and Ashley came by for their weekly visit. They were both excited about the wedding, which was now just 10 weeks away. Ashley showed me pictures of the flower arrangements she'd chosen, each bouquet costing more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. David talked about the honeymoon they'd planned in Hawaii, staying at a resort that charged $600 a night. We're so grateful for all your help, Mrs. Thompson, Ashley said, giving me a hug as they prepared to leave. David told me how generous you've been with contributing to the wedding. It means so much to know his family supports our happiness. I smiled and accepted her hug, but inside I was seething. David had told her I was contributing to their wedding as gifts, not loans. He'd lied to his fiancée just as thoroughly as he'd lied to me. Ashley had no idea that her fairy tale wedding was being funded with stolen money. After they left, I sat in my living room and looked around at the house Frank and I had built together. Every piece of furniture told a story. The couch where I'd nursed 3 babies and comforted them through childhood illnesses. The dining room table where we'd shared thousands of family meals. The bedroom where Frank had died in his sleep, holding my hand. This house was more than just property to me. It was my sanctuary, my security, and my connection to the life Frank and I had built together. David living here had been a temporary arrangement while he got back on his feet after his second divorce. I'd never intended for it to become permanent, and I certainly hadn't intended for him to use my home as collateral for his theft. The papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a professional courier who asked me to sign for them. Janet had prepared everything exactly as we'd discussed, and the legal language was clear and unambiguous. David had 30 days to vacate the premises. If he refused to leave voluntarily, I could have him legally evicted. I called David that afternoon and asked him to come over alone. I needed to handle this conversation without Ashley present, both for her sake and for his. He arrived an hour later, seeming relaxed and cheerful. Hey Mom, what's up? Ashley's working late again, so I thought maybe we could grab dinner somewhere. David, sit down. We need to talk. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his casual demeanor shifted slightly. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd confessed to stealing my money 2 weeks earlier. I placed the eviction notice on the table between us. I need you to read this. David picked up the papers and scanned them quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger in the space of about 30 seconds. You're evicting me? Your own son? You're a grown man who stole nearly $50,000 from his mother. I don't owe you free housing on top of everything else you've taken from me. Mom, this is crazy. You can't just throw me out. I've been living here for 3 years. As a favor to help you get back on your feet, not as a permanent arrangement. And certainly not so you could use my generosity as an excuse to steal from me. David stood up and began pacing again, the papers clutched in his hand. This is about the money, isn't it? You're punishing me because I borrowed some money for my wedding. The word borrowed made my blood pressure spike. You didn't borrow anything, David. You stole it. And when I confronted you, you showed no remorse and refused to pay it back. I told you I'd pay you back after the wedding. With what money? You don't have a steady job. You're about to spend $30,000 on a single party, and you're planning an expensive honeymoon. Where exactly is this payback money going to come from? David stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was cold, calculating, almost predatory. You know what, Mom? Maybe it's time someone told you the truth. You're a lonely old woman who's trying to control her children with money. Dad's been dead for 7 years, and you're still acting like you're half of a couple. The only reason any of us visit you is because we feel sorry for you. The words hit me like a slap across the face. This wasn't grief or desperation talking. This was cruelty, pure and simple. David was trying to hurt me because I dared to stand up to him. Get out, I said quietly. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too. No, it's not. It's my home, and you have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. David's face was flushed with anger. You can't do this. I'll fight it. I'll contest the eviction. On what grounds? You don't pay rent, you're not on the deed, and you have no legal claim to this property. Janet Morrison explained all of this to me very clearly. The mention of my lawyer seemed to deflate some of David's bluster. He knew Janet's reputation, and he knew she wouldn't have advised me to take action unless it was legally solid. What about the wedding? He asked, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. If you kick me out, we'll have to spend money on rent instead of paying you back. You're shooting yourself in the foot here, the wedding that you're paying for with my stolen money. I think I can live without getting an invitation. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him realize that I was serious. There would be no more loans, no more bailouts, no more enabling his irresponsible behavior. The free ride was over. Fine, he said finally. But don't expect me to forgive you for this. You're choosing money over family. No, David, you chose money over family when you stole from me. I'm just dealing with the consequences of your choice. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I was taking control of my own life, instead of being victimized by someone else's choices. That evening, Carol came over with a bottle of wine and a homemade casserole. We sat on my back patio, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. How did he take it? She asked. About as well as you'd expect. He tried to make me feel guilty, told me I was a lonely old woman trying to control people with money. Carol snorted. That's rich, coming from a man who literally stole his mother's life savings. Projection, that's what they call it. Accusing you of doing what he's actually doing. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping wine and enjoying the peaceful evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of the eviction spread through the family, but tonight I was content to sit in my own backyard, on my own property, feeling like I'd finally started fighting back. You know what the best part is? I said eventually. What's that? For 45 years I've been making excuses for David's behavior, telling myself he'd grow out of it, that he just needed more time to mature, that underneath it all he was a good person who'd made some mistakes. But stealing from me wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And it showed me exactly who he really is. Carol raised her wine glass. To seeing people clearly, even when it hurts. To seeing people clearly, I agreed, clinking my glass against hers. As the stars came out over the Arizona desert, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful. I felt like the strong, competent woman who'd spent 3 decades saving lives in the emergency room, not the pushover grandmother who'd been funding her son's irresponsible lifestyle. David thought he could steal from me and face no consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he was. And if his precious wedding got derailed in the process, well, that was just the price of crossing a woman who'd finally decided to fight back. The real battle was just beginning. The phone started ringing at 7 in the morning, 3 days after I'd served David with the eviction notice. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when Linda's number appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, along with the next 4 calls from various family members who'd apparently gotten wind of what was happening. I waited until I'd finished my coffee and toast before listening to the messages. Linda's voice was strained with worry, asking me to call her back immediately because David had told her something crazy about being evicted. Robert had called from Denver, his usually calm voice tight with confusion as he asked what was going on with David and whether I needed help with anything. Even my sister Ruth from Tucson had called, saying she'd heard disturbing rumors and wanted to know if I was having some kind of breakdown. The last message was from Ashley, and her voice was shaking as she spoke. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Ashley. David told me something terrible has happened, but I don't understand what's going on. Could you please call me back? I'm really worried about everything." I deleted all the messages and poured myself another cup of coffee. David had clearly launched a campaign to turn the family against me, probably painting himself as the victim of an unreasonable and vindictive mother. It was exactly what I'd expected him to do. By 10 o'clock, the calls had intensified. My phone was ringing every 15 minutes, and I could see neighbors peeking out their windows as various family members drove by my house, apparently checking to see if I was still alive and coherent. The whole situation would have been amusing if it weren't so exhausting. Finally, I decided to end the speculation by calling a family meeting. I sent a group text to Linda, Robert, and my sister Ruth, asking them to come to my house on Saturday afternoon for a conversation about David's situation. I deliberately didn't invite David himself. This discussion was going to happen without his theatrical interruptions and manipulative sob stories. Linda arrived first on Saturday, pulling into my driveway in her practical Honda Civic, with her jaw set in the determined expression she'd worn since childhood when she was preparing for an unpleasant conversation. She'd driven down from Flagstaff that morning, a 3-hour trip she wouldn't have made unless she was genuinely concerned. "Mom," she said as soon as I opened the front door, "please tell me you haven't lost your mind." "Hello to you too, sweetheart. Come in and sit down. We'll wait for the others before we talk." Robert's rental car pulled up 20 minutes later. He'd flown in from Denver the night before and was staying at a hotel near the airport, which told me he was taking the situation very seriously. Robert was the kind of man who didn't make unnecessary trips or spend money on last-minute flights unless there was a genuine emergency. Ruth arrived last, driving her ancient Buick with the careful precision of someone who'd been behind the wheel for 60 years and didn't trust other drivers to follow the rules. At 78, she was 6 years older than me and had appointed herself the family matriarch after our mother died 20 years ago. We gathered in my living room, the same space where I'd spent countless holidays and birthdays with my children over the years. The afternoon light streaming through my windows illuminated the family photos covering my mantel, pictures of happier times when we'd all believed David's promises and potential. "All right, Mom," Linda said, settling into Frank's old recliner with her arms crossed. "David says you've gone crazy and are trying to destroy his life. He says you're evicting him for no reason and trying to ruin his wedding. What's really going on?" I looked around at these 3 people who'd traveled hundreds of miles because they were worried about me, and I felt a familiar mix of love and frustration. They cared enough to show up, but they'd already decided David was the victim in this situation. "David stole $47,000 from my savings account," I said simply. When I confronted him about it, he showed no remorse and refused to pay it back, so I'm evicting him from my house. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's mouth fell open. Robert leaned forward in his chair as if he hadn't heard me correctly. Ruth's eyebrows disappeared under her gray bangs. "That's impossible," Linda said finally. "David wouldn't steal from you. He's irresponsible with money, but he's not a criminal." I walked to my desk and retrieved the folder where I'd organized all the evidence Carol and I had compiled. Bank statements, withdrawal records, my handwritten notes about each loan David had requested, and copies of the eviction papers Janet had prepared. I spread everything out on my coffee table like a detective presenting evidence to a jury. "Look for yourselves," I said. They spent the next 20 minutes going through the papers, their expressions shifting from skepticism to shock to outrage as the scope of David's theft became clear. Robert, who worked with financial data every day, was the first to grasp the full magnitude of what had happened. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the bank statements. "Mom, this is everything you had saved." "Almost everything," I confirmed. "Frank and I spent 40 years building that nest egg. David spent it in 6 months on his girlfriend's dream wedding." Ruth picked up the eviction notice and read it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the legal language. "You're really throwing him out? Your own son? He's a 45-year-old man who stole from his mother. Yes, I'm throwing him out." Linda was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the evidence of her brother's betrayal. "I can't believe he did this. I mean, I knew he was bad with money, but this is theft. This is a felony." "Why didn't you call the police?" Robert asked. "Mom, you could have him arrested for this." I sat down across from them, feeling suddenly tired. "Because he's my son, and I didn't want to send him to prison. But I also couldn't let him think there would be no consequences for stealing from me." "So you decided to evict him instead," Ruth said thoughtfully. "That's actually quite clever. It solves your immediate problem without destroying his future completely." "Exactly. He can find somewhere else to live, and maybe having to pay rent will teach him something about financial responsibility." Linda wiped her eyes with a tissue. "What about the wedding? If David has to move out and start paying rent, he won't be able to afford all those deposits." This was the question I'd been expecting, and it cut to the heart of why David's theft was so infuriating. He'd stolen my money to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford, and now everyone was worried about protecting him from the consequences of his choices. "The wedding that he's paying for with my stolen money?" I asked. "Linda, that's not my problem to solve." "But Ashley doesn't know where the money came from," Robert pointed out. "She thinks her parents contributed. This will destroy her too." "Then maybe David should have thought about that before he stole from me to impress his girlfriend." Ruth leaned back in her chair and studied my face with the sharp intelligence that had made her a successful accountant for 50 years. "You're angrier than I've ever seen you, Maggie. This isn't just about the money, is it?" She was right, as usual. Ruth had always been able to see through surface explanations to the deeper emotions underneath. "It's about respect," I said finally. "For 45 years, I've supported David through every failure and bad decision. I've given him money, housing, emotional support, and endless second chances. And when he needed more money than I was willing to give, he just took it. He didn't see me as his mother who deserved honesty and respect. He saw me as a resource to be exploited." "And when you confronted him about it?" Linda asked. "He told me I was being unreasonable to expect my money back. He said I was a lonely old woman trying to control people with money. He made it clear that he felt entitled to take whatever he wanted from me." The room fell silent again as they processed this information. I could see them struggling to reconcile the David they thought they knew with the David who would steal from his mother and show no remorse. "What can we do to help?" Robert asked finally. "Nothing. This is between David and me." "Mom, he's going to make your life miserable over this," Linda warned. "You know how he gets when he doesn't get his way. He'll probably try to turn the whole family against you." "He's already started," I said, gesturing toward my phone. "I've had a dozen calls from relatives who think I've lost my mind." Ruth stood up and walked to my front window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood where I had lived for nearly 40 years. "You know what I think?" she said finally. "I think David has been getting away with selfish behavior for so long that he's forgotten other people have feelings and rights. Maybe it's time someone reminded him." "Are you saying I should go through with the eviction?" "I'm saying you should do whatever you think is right for your own well-being. You've earned the right to live in peace without worrying about being stolen from." Linda and Robert exchanged glances, and I could see them having one of those silent conversations that siblings develop over decades of shared experience. "We support you, Mom," Linda said finally. "What David did was wrong, and you shouldn't have to tolerate it just because he's family." "But we're worried about you being alone in all this," Robert added. "If David gets vindictive, we want to make sure you're protected." Their support meant more to me than I could express. For days, I'd been second-guessing my decision, wondering if I was being too harsh or if there was some other solution I hadn't considered. Having my other children validate my choice gave me the strength to see it through. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking through the practical aspects of what would happen next. Robert offered to fly back from Denver if I needed help dealing with David's belongings. Linda said she could take time off work to stay with me if things got ugly. Ruth volunteered to handle phone calls from other relatives who might question my decision. "There's one more thing," I said as they prepared to leave. "I don't want any of you to feel like you have to choose sides in this. David is your brother, and I don't expect you to cut him out of your lives because of what happened between him and me." "Mom, what he did to you affects all of us," Linda said firmly. "If he's willing to steal from you, how do we know he won't steal from us? How do we know he hasn't already?" It was a sobering thought. If David could rationalize taking $47,000 from his mother, what would stop him from taking advantage of his siblings when he needed money? After they left, I felt both relieved and apprehensive. Having my family's support made me feel less isolated, but I knew the real confrontation was still coming. David had been ominously quiet since I'd served him with the eviction notice, and his silence worried me more than his anger would have. I didn't have to wait long to find out what he was planning. On Monday morning, I was watering my plants in the backyard when I heard raised voices coming from the front of the house. I walked around the side of the building and saw David standing on my front porch with Ashley, both of them looking upset and animated. "She's lost her mind," David was saying loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "She's become paranoid and vindictive since Dad died. I think she might have dementia or something." Ashley looked uncomfortable with the public nature of this conversation, glancing around nervously at the houses across the street. "Maybe we should just go inside and talk to her privately." "There's no reasoning with her when she gets like this," David continued. "She's convinced herself that I'm some kind of criminal, and nothing I say will change her mind." I stepped into view, and both of them stopped talking abruptly. "David, Ashley," I said calmly, "what can I do for you?" David's face was flushed with anger, and what looked like embarrassment at being caught talking about me. "We need to discuss this eviction nonsense, Mom. You're being completely unreasonable." "There's nothing to discuss. You have 24 days left to find alternative housing." Ashley stepped forward, her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Thompson, I don't understand what's happening. David says there was some kind of misunderstanding about money, but surely we can work this out. Can't we just sit down and talk about it?" I looked at this young woman who seemed genuinely confused and distressed, and I felt sorry for her. She had no idea that her fairy tale wedding was being funded with stolen money, and she was about to become collateral damage in the war between David and me. "Ashley, has David explained to you where the money for your wedding is coming from?" She glanced uncertainly at David, who was glaring at me with undisguised fury. "He said your family was contributing to help us get started. His family, I mean. Our family." "I see. And did he mention that this contribution was actually him taking money from my savings account without my permission?" The color drained from Ashley's face. "What?" "That's not what happened," David said quickly. "Mom, you're twisting everything. You know I was going to pay you back." "Ashley," I said gently, "David took $47,000 from my savings account to pay for your wedding expenses. He didn't ask permission, and when I discovered what he'd done, he refused to return the money." Ashley stared at David in shock. "You stole from your mother?" "I borrowed it," David insisted. "There's a difference." "Without asking," I clarified, "and without any realistic plan to pay it back." Ashley sat down heavily on my porch steps, her hands shaking. "Oh my God! David, how could you do this? How could you lie to me?" "I didn't lie to you. I just didn't explain all the details. You told me your family was helping us. You let me think they were happy about the wedding and wanted to support us. But you stole the money?" Her voice was rising with each word. "Ashley, calm down. You're being dramatic." "Dramatic? I'm being dramatic because my fiancé is a thief who lied to me about how we're paying for our wedding?" This was not how David had expected this conversation to go. He'd clearly thought he could manipulate Ashley into taking his side, probably by portraying me as an unreasonable old woman who was trying to ruin their happiness. Instead, Ashley was horrified by what she'd learned. "Look, we can fix this," David said desperately. "Mom, What if we pay you back a little at a time? We could set up a payment plan. With what money, David? You're about to be homeless, you don't have a steady job, and you're planning to spend the next 3 months' salary on a single party. The wedding is an investment in our future, he said, falling back on the rationalization he'd been using for months. It's a party, David. An expensive party that you can't afford without stealing from me. Ashley stood up abruptly. I can't do this. I can't marry someone who would steal from his own mother and then lie to me about it. Ashley, wait, David called as she started walking toward her car. You're overreacting. We can work this out. She turned back to face him, tears streaming down her face. Work it out? David, you stole $50,000 from your mother to pay for our wedding. There's no working that out. There's no excuse for that. It's not $50,000, David protested weakly. It's 47. Ashley stared at him in disbelief. That's what you're focusing on? The exact amount? She got in her car and drove away, leaving David standing on my porch looking stunned. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Look what you've done, he said finally, turning to face me. You've ruined everything. I didn't ruin anything, David. You did that all by yourself when you decided to steal from me. She'll come around. Once she has time to think about it, she'll realize you're just trying to cause trouble. I looked at my son, this man who still believed he could charm his way out of any consequence, and I realized that nothing I could say would make him understand the magnitude of what he'd done. You have 24 days to move out, I said. I suggest you start looking for an apartment. As I walked back into my house, I heard David kicking something on the porch, probably one of my flower pots. Through my front window, I watched him stand there for several minutes, apparently trying to decide what to do next. Finally, he got in his car and drove away. That evening, Ashley called me. Her voice was calm but sad, and she sounded older than her 28 years. Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to apologize for what happened today. I had no idea where the money was coming from, and I'm horrified that David would do something like that. You don't need to apologize, Ashley. You didn't do anything wrong. I called off the wedding. I can't marry someone who would steal from his family and then lie to me about it. But I feel terrible about all the deposits we'll lose. I know some of that money was yours. That's not your responsibility to worry about, I told her. You made the right choice. I keep thinking about all the times we visited you, all the times you were so kind to me, and I had no idea what was really happening. I feel like such a fool. You trusted someone you loved. That doesn't make you a fool. After we hung up, I sat in my living room feeling a complex mix of emotions. I was sorry that Ashley had been hurt by David's actions, but I was also relieved that she'd had the strength to walk away from a man who could lie to her so easily. She deserved better than David, and I hoped she'd find it. The next morning, I woke up to find my garbage cans overturned and trash scattered across my front yard. My mailbox had been knocked over, and someone had spray-painted "Bitter Old Witch" across my garage door in red letters. I called Carol, who came over immediately with cleaning supplies and a determination to help me deal with this latest escalation. "That little bastard," she said, surveying the damage. "This is destruction of property." "You should call the police." "I will if it happens again. But for now, I just want to clean it up and move on." We spent the morning scrubbing graffiti off my garage door and picking up scattered garbage. Several neighbors stopped by to offer help and express their outrage at what had happened. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over security camera footage from her doorbell that clearly showed David vandalizing my property at 3 in the morning. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you, Maggie," she said. David should be ashamed of himself. By afternoon, my property was restored to its normal condition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. David was angry and desperate people do unpredictable things. That evening, I sat on my back patio with a glass of wine, watching the desert sunset and thinking about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. 3 months ago, I'd been a grandmother, helping her son plan his wedding. Now I was a woman who'd discovered her son was a thief and had to protect herself from his retaliation. The transformation had been swift and shocking, but I didn't regret the choices I'd made. For too long, I'd enabled David's irresponsible behavior by bailing him out whenever he got into trouble. Maybe if someone had held him accountable years ago, he wouldn't have become the kind of man who could steal from his mother without remorse. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Janet Morrison, my lawyer. "Mrs. Thompson, I heard there was some vandalism at your house last night. Are you all right?" News traveled fast in a city like Scottsdale. "I'm fine, Janet. Just some garbage cans and graffiti. Nothing I can't handle." "Have you considered filing a restraining order? Given the amount of money involved and his recent behavior, you might have grounds." I thought about it for a moment. A restraining order would be the nuclear option, the final step in cutting David out of my life completely. "Not yet," I said finally. "Let's see how he handles the next few weeks." "All right, but please don't hesitate to call if you feel unsafe. What he did last night was criminal harassment, and you don't have to tolerate it." After I hung up, I realized that David had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Stealing my money had been a betrayal of trust. Lying to Ashley had shown his willingness to manipulate people he claimed to love. But vandalizing my home was an act of pure spite, designed to intimidate and punish me for standing up to him. The scared, guilty part of me that had been wondering if I was being too harsh disappeared completely. David had shown me exactly who he was, and I finally believed him. I had 18 days left until the eviction deadline, and I suspected they were going to be the longest 18 days of my life. The security camera I'd installed after the vandalism incident proved to be one of the best investments I'd ever made. Over the next week, it captured David driving by my house at all hours, sometimes stopping to stare at the windows, sometimes just cruising past slowly like he was casing the place. Each time I watched the footage, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arizona desert nights. Carol had taken to calling me every morning and evening to check in, and she wasn't subtle about her growing concern for my safety. "Maggie, honey, this behavior is escalating," she said during one of our evening conversations. "Normal people don't stalk their mother's houses in the middle of the night." She was right, but I was determined not to let David's intimidation tactics drive me from my own home. I'd lived in this house for 38 years, and I wasn't about to let a 45-year-old bully force me into hiding. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, 12 days before the eviction deadline. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the sound of shattering glass from my living room. I grabbed the baseball bat Frank had kept by our bedroom door and crept toward the front of the house, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My front window had been broken by a rock the size of a softball, and glass covered my carpet like dangerous confetti. Attached to the rock was a piece of paper with a message scrawled in David's familiar handwriting. "Cancel the B2 eviction or this gets worse." I called 911 immediately, then Carol, then Janet Morrison. Within an hour, my living room was full of police officers, a crime scene photographer, and my lawyer, all of them treating my broken window like evidence in a serious criminal case. Officer Martinez, a young woman who reminded me of my daughter Linda, was the lead investigator. She examined the rock and note carefully, taking photos from multiple angles before sealing them in evidence bags. "Mrs. Thompson, have you been having ongoing problems with your son?" she asked, settling into my kitchen chair with a notepad and pen. I told her everything, starting with the theft of my savings and progressing through the eviction notice, the vandalism, and now this escalation to property destruction and threats. Officer Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts. "This sounds like a pattern of escalating harassment," she said when I finished. "Have you considered filing for a restraining order?" "My lawyer has suggested it, but I kept hoping David would come to his senses and accept the consequences of his actions." "Mrs. Thompson, throwing rocks through someone's window with threatening notes attached isn't the behavior of someone who's coming to their senses. This is the behavior of someone who's becoming dangerous." The word dangerous hung in the air like smoke. I'd been thinking of David as irresponsible, selfish, even cruel, but I hadn't quite made the leap to considering him dangerous. Hearing it from a police officer made it real in a way that chilled me to the bone. Janet spoke up from her spot on my couch. "Officer Martinez, what would you recommend as next steps?" "I'm going to file charges for criminal damage to property and harassment. We'll issue a warrant for David Thompson's arrest." "Mrs. Thompson, I strongly suggest you file for an emergency restraining order tomorrow morning." This behavior is escalating, and we need to get ahead of it before someone gets hurt. After everyone left, I sat in my living room, staring at the plywood board Carol's husband had nailed over my broken window. The house felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt genuinely afraid. I called Linda, even though it was past 10 o'clock and I knew she'd be getting ready for bed. "Mom, what's wrong?" She answered on the first ring, instantly alert in the way that mothers develop when their children are in trouble. I explained what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady and matter-of-fact. Linda listened in stunned silence, occasionally making small sounds of distress. "I'm driving down there tonight," she said when I finished. "You shouldn't be alone in that house." "Linda, you have to work tomorrow, and the girls have school." "I'm fine." "Mom." David threw a rock through your window with a threatening note. "You're not fine, and I'm not leaving you alone to deal with this." 3 hours later, Linda pulled into my driveway with an overnight bag and a thermos of coffee for the drive. She'd left her daughters with their father and taken emergency leave from her teaching job to come protect her mother from her brother. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. "I can't believe it's come to this," she said as we sat in my kitchen, both of us too wired to sleep despite the late hour. "David stealing money was bad enough, but threatening you? Trying to intimidate you in your own home? This isn't the brother I grew up with." "Maybe it is," I said quietly. "Maybe this is who David has always been, and we just didn't want to see it." Linda was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug in her hands. "You know what the worst part is? I keep thinking about all the times over the years when David would tell us stories about people who'd wronged him. Employers who fired him unfairly, girlfriends who left him for no reason, landlords who evicted him without cause. I always felt sorry for him and assumed he was just unlucky. And now? Now I'm wondering if those people saw something in David that we missed. Maybe they weren't the villains in his stories. Maybe they were just trying to protect themselves from someone who wouldn't take responsibility for his own actions. It was a sobering thought. How many of David's tales of victimhood had actually been stories of consequences he'd faced for behavior we'd never known about? The next morning, Linda and I went to the courthouse together to file for an emergency restraining order. The process was more complicated than I'd expected, involving multiple forms, a hearing with a judge, and detailed testimony about David's escalating behavior. Judge Patricia Williams was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and no patience for legal nonsense. She reviewed my application carefully, examining the police report from the previous evening and the evidence photos of my vandalized property. "Mrs. Thompson, you're requesting a restraining order against your own son. This is a serious step that will have significant legal consequences for him. Are you certain this is necessary?" I thought about David's face when he'd dismissed my concerns about my stolen savings. I thought about the graffiti on my garage door and the rock through my window. I thought about Ashley's devastated expression when she learned her fiancé was a thief. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm certain." Judge Williams signed the order without hesitation. David would be prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my house, my workplace, or anywhere else I regularly spent time. If he violated the order, he could be arrested immediately and charged with contempt of court. "The order will be served on him today," the bailiff explained as we left the courthouse. "Once he's been served, it goes into effect immediately." Linda and I stopped for lunch at a small cafe near the courthouse, both of us emotionally drained from the morning's proceedings. I picked at my salad, my appetite suppressed by the stress of having to take legal action against my own child. "How did we get here?" I asked Linda. "How did it come to the point where I need a court order to protect myself from my own son?" "Because David made choices," Linda said firmly. "Bad choices that hurt people who loved him. This isn't your fault, Mom. You tried to help him, and he responded by stealing from you and threatening you. You're doing what you have to do to protect yourself." My phone rang as we were finishing lunch. Janet Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. "Mrs. Thompson, I have some news. David was arrested this morning on the charges from last night. He's being held on a $5,000 bond." The news hit me like a physical blow. My son was in jail. The child I'd rocked to sleep when he was a baby. The boy I'd cheered for at Little League games. The young man I'd been so proud of when he graduated from high school was sitting in a jail cell because he'd threatened his own mother. "Are you all right?" Janet asked when I didn't respond immediately. "I don't know," I admitted. I knew this was possible, but hearing it actually happened is different. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand something. David brought this on himself. You didn't put him in jail. His choices put him in jail." After I hung up, Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Janet's right, Mom. This isn't your fault. Then why does it feel like I've destroyed my own family? Because you love him, even after everything he's done. That's what makes you a good mother, not a bad one." We drove home in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed a strange car parked across the street with a woman sitting behind the wheel. She got out as we approached the house, and I recognized Ashley's blonde hair and hesitant smile. "Mrs. Thompson," she called out, walking toward us with obvious nervousness. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard about what happened last night. I wanted to make sure you were okay." I introduced Ashley to Linda, and we invited her inside for coffee. She looked terrible, with dark circles under her eyes and the pale, drawn appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "I can't believe David would do something like this," she said, settling into my kitchen chair. "Breaking your window, threatening you. I keep trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man who would steal from his mother and then terrorize her." "How are you holding up?" I asked. Ashley's laugh was bitter. "Not well. I called off the wedding, moved out of David's apartment, and I'm staying with a friend until I can find my own place. I also had to call everyone we'd invited and explain that the wedding was canceled. That was fun. I'm sorry you're going through this because of David's choices. Don't apologize for him, Mrs. Thompson. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I'm the one who should be apologizing. I should have seen the red flags. The way he talked about money, the way he always had an excuse when things went wrong, the way he blamed other people for his problems. I should have known he was capable of something like this." Linda leaned forward with interest. "What kind of red flags?" Ashley was quiet for a moment, apparently deciding how much to share. "Well, David told me that his first wife left him because she was materialistic and didn't understand his entrepreneurial spirit. His second wife supposedly couldn't handle his ambition and wanted him to settle for a boring job. But after I learned about the theft, I started thinking about those stories differently." "How so? What if they left him because he was financially irresponsible or dishonest? What if his entrepreneurial spirit was actually him avoiding steady work and expecting other people to support his schemes?" I started wondering if I was just the latest in a long line of women who'd been manipulated by David's charm. It was a chilling thought, and it aligned perfectly with Linda's earlier observation about David's pattern of portraying himself as the victim in every situation. "Have you talked to his ex-wives?" Linda asked. I reached out to his second wife, Jennifer, on social media. She was initially hesitant to talk to me, but when I explained what had happened, she opened up. David had stolen money from her too, not as much as he took from your mother, but enough to cause serious financial problems. She said she left him when she realized he felt entitled to spend her money however he wanted. The pattern was becoming clear. David didn't just steal from me because he was desperate about his wedding. He stole from me because he'd learned over the years that he could take advantage of women who cared about him, and there would always be minimal consequences. The scariest part, Ashley continued, is that I think he actually believes his own justifications. When I confronted him about lying to me, he seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. He kept saying he was protecting me from unnecessary stress, like lying to your fiancé about stealing money is some kind of noble gesture. We talked for another hour, sharing stories about David's behavior and trying to make sense of how someone we'd all cared about could be so willing to hurt the people who loved him. Ashley left with my phone number and a promise to stay in touch, and I found myself hoping she'd be able to move on and find someone worthy of her kindness. That evening, Linda and I were cleaning up after dinner when the phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number, which surprised me since I assumed he was still in jail. "Mom, please don't hang up," David's voice came through the speaker, sounding strained and desperate. "I need to talk to you." "David, you're supposed to be in jail." "Ashley bailed me out. Look, Mom, I know things have gotten out of hand, but we need to fix this. The restraining order, the charges, all of it. We're family, and families work things out." The audacity of it stunned me. He'd stolen my life savings, threatened me, vandalized my property, and now he wanted to work things out, like we'd had a minor disagreement about holiday plans. "David, you threw a rock through my window with a threatening note attached. There's nothing to work out." I was angry and desperate. "I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean we can't move past it." "A mistake? David, you've been terrorizing me for weeks. This isn't a mistake. It's a pattern of escalating harassment." "Mom, listen to me. If you don't drop the charges and cancel the restraining order, I'm going to lose everything. I'll have a criminal record. No one will hire me. My life will be ruined." And there it was, the same selfish thinking that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. He wasn't calling to apologize or express remorse for what he'd done to me. He was calling because he was finally facing consequences and wanted me to make them go away. "Your life isn't my responsibility to fix, David. You ruined it yourself when you chose to steal from me and then threaten me when I stood up to you. So that's it? You're just going to destroy your own son over money?" The question hit me like a slap. Even now, after everything he'd done, David was trying to make me feel guilty for protecting myself from his abuse. "David, I didn't destroy you. Your choices destroyed you. And they weren't choices about money. They were choices about respect, honesty, and how you treat people who love you. I never meant to hurt you, Mom. You have to believe that. But you did hurt me, David. You stole my security. You lied to my face, you vandalized my home, and you tried to intimidate me into letting you get away with it. Intent doesn't matter when the damage is this severe." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment I wondered if he'd hung up. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold and distant. "But don't expect me to forgive you for this. You had a choice between protecting some money and protecting your relationship with your son, and you chose the money. I hope it was worth it." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. Even in his final words, David had managed to twist the situation to make himself the victim. According to his version of events, I was the unreasonable one for refusing to let him steal from me without consequences. Linda, who had heard the entire conversation, shook her head in amazement. "He really doesn't get it, does he? He actually thinks you're the one who's being unfair. I don't think he's capable of seeing it any other way." Taking responsibility for his actions would require admitting that he's not the victim in this story, and that seems to be psychologically impossible for him. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the phone call. Part of me had been hoping that facing arrest and the prospect of criminal charges would shock David into understanding the seriousness of his actions. Instead, it had only made him more desperate and manipulative. I thought about all the years I'd made excuses for David's behavior, all the times I'd convinced myself that he was just going through a difficult phase and would eventually mature into the responsible adult I believed he could be. I'd enabled his selfishness by constantly rescuing him from the consequences of his poor choices, and I'd taught him that there would always be someone to clean up his messes. But I'd also realized something important over the past few weeks. I couldn't save David from himself, and trying to do so had only made both of us miserable. The kindest thing I could do for him now was to let him face the full consequences of his actions, even if that meant he might never forgive me. The next morning brought news that David had violated his bond conditions by calling me. Officer Martinez explained that the recorded jail call would be used as evidence of continued harassment, and David's bond would likely be revoked. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand that this man is not going to stop trying to manipulate and intimidate you. Every time you engage with him, you're giving him hope that he can wear you down and get what he wants. What are you suggesting? Change your phone number. Don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize. If he tries to contact you through other family members, don't respond. Make it clear that any communication needs to go through lawyers." It felt extreme, but I was beginning to understand that extreme measures were necessary when dealing with someone who refused to accept reasonable boundaries. Linda helped me contact my phone company that afternoon to change my number. We also installed additional security measures around the house, including motion sensor lights and a doorbell camera. I felt like I was turning my home into a fortress, but it was better than feeling vulnerable and afraid. 2 days later, Janet called with an update on David's legal situation. He's been charged with violating his bond conditions, and the judge revoked his bail. He'll be staying in jail until his trial, which is scheduled for next month. How long could he be sentenced to? For the combination of charges, possibly up to 2 years in state prison. It depends on whether he has any prior convictions and how the judge views the escalating nature of his behavior. 2 years. My son could be in prison for 2 years because he'd chosen to steal from me and then terrorize me when I refused to enable his theft. The magnitude of how completely David had destroyed his own life was staggering. That evening, I sat on my back patio watching the sunset and reflecting on everything that had happened over the past month. I'd started this journey simply wanting my stolen money back. I'd ended up having to protect myself from my own son with restraining orders and criminal charges. But I'd also discovered something important about myself. I was stronger than I'd realized, more capable of standing up for myself than I'd ever imagined. For too many years, I'd prioritized keeping peace in the family over protecting my own well-being. I'd learned that sometimes love requires tough choices, even when those choices feel like punishment. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Robert, calling from Denver. "Mom, I heard about David's arrest from Linda. Are you okay?" "I'm as okay as I can be under the circumstances. I'm flying out there this weekend. I want to be there for you during the trial." The support from my other children had been overwhelming. They'd both taken time off work, rearranged their schedules, and spent their own money to help me through this crisis. Their loyalty and love had been a bright spot in an otherwise dark situation. "You don't need to do that, Robert. I have Linda here and Janet to handle the legal aspects." "Mom, you're going to have to testify against your own son in a criminal trial. You shouldn't have to go through that alone." He was right. Testifying against David would be one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do, and having my family's support would make it bearable. As I hung up the phone, I realized that David's actions had done more than just steal my money and threaten my safety. They'd also revealed the true character of everyone in our family. Linda and Robert had shown themselves to be loyal, supportive children who would stand by me even when it was difficult. David had shown himself to be someone who would victimize his own mother and then blame her for his consequences. In destroying my trust and security, David had accidentally given me a gift. He'd shown me exactly who my real family was. And it wasn't necessarily the people who shared my blood. It was the people who showed up when I needed them, who supported my right to be treated with respect, and who loved me enough to help me stand up for myself. The trial was still 3 weeks away, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was ready to tell my story, to hold David accountable for his choices, and to finally close this chapter of my life. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the knowledge that I'd found the strength to protect myself and the support to help me through it. David had thought he could steal from me and intimidate me into silence. Instead, he'd helped me discover just how strong I really was. That might not have been the lesson he intended to teach, but it was the lesson I needed to learn. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches that reminded me of church pews and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, flanked by Linda and Robert, both of whom had kept their promise to be there for me during the trial. David sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his 45 years. His court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s, had apparently advised him to plead guilty to the harassment charges in exchange for a reduced sentence on the theft counts. Judge Williams, the same woman who had signed my restraining order, presided over the proceedings with the same no-nonsense efficiency I remembered from our earlier encounter. When she called my name to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than I'd expected. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Ms. Chen, guided me through my testimony with gentle but thorough questions. I explained the timeline of David's theft, the discovery of my missing savings, his refusal to return the money, and the escalating harassment that followed. When she asked me to read aloud the threatening note that had been attached to the rock thrown through my window, my voice only wavered slightly. David's attorney had few questions for me during cross-examination, probably because the evidence against his client was overwhelming. David himself never looked at me during my testimony. choosing instead to stare at his hands folded on the table in front of him. The hardest moment came when Judge Williams asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement before sentencing. I'd prepared remarks, but when I stood up to speak, I found myself looking directly at David for the first time since the trial began. Your Honor, David is my son and I love him despite everything that's happened. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse, and it doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. David made a series of choices that hurt me financially, emotionally, and physically. He stole my sense of security in my own home. When I stood up to him, he tried to punish me for it. I paused, watching David's face. He was finally looking at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. As if he was finally understanding the full impact of what he'd done. I hope that serving time will give David the opportunity to reflect on his choices and develop the empathy he seems to lack. I hope he can become the man I always believed he could be. But whether he changes or not, I want this court to know that his victims deserve justice, and his actions deserve consequences. Judge Williams sentenced David to 18 months in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months if he completed anger management and financial responsibility courses. She also ordered him to pay restitution for my stolen savings, though everyone in the courtroom understood that it might be years before I saw any of that money. As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at me one last time. For a moment I thought he might say something, offer some kind of apology or acknowledgement. Instead, he just shook his head sadly, as if I had disappointed him by refusing to save him from the consequences of his own actions. Outside the courthouse, Linda, Robert, and I stood in the desert sunshine, emotionally drained but relieved that the legal proceedings were finally over. "How do you feel, Mom?" Robert asked. "Empty," I said honestly. "Not happy, not vindicated, just empty. Like something important has ended, but I'm not sure what comes next." "What comes next is you get your life back," Linda said firmly. "You get to live in your own house without being afraid. You get to rebuild your savings without worrying about someone stealing them. You get to choose who you trust and who you let into your life." She was right, of course. The restraining order would remain in effect for 3 years, which meant David couldn't contact me or come near my property even after his release from prison. For the first time in months, I could sleep peacefully in my own bed without wondering if someone was going to vandalize my home or threaten me. 6 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen with Carol, drinking coffee and planning a trip to visit Linda and my granddaughters in Flagstaff. The plywood had been removed from my front window and replaced with new glass. The spray-painted graffiti had been completely removed from my garage door. My house looked exactly as it had before David's campaign of harassment began. "Any word from him?" Carol asked, though she already knew the answer. I'd received no letters, no phone calls, no messages through other family members. David was serving his sentence in silence, apparently having finally accepted that I wasn't going to rescue him from this situation. Nothing, and I'm okay with that. I think we both need time to process everything that happened. "Do you think you'll ever have a relationship with him again?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. I don't know. Maybe, if he gets help and genuinely changes. But it would have to be a completely different relationship than what we had before. I can't go back to being the mother who enables his bad choices and cleans up his messes. Ashley had stopped by a few weeks earlier to update me on her life. She'd found a new job with better pay, moved into her own apartment, and was dating a man who worked as a teacher and treated her with the respect David never had. She seemed happier and more confident than I'd ever seen her. "The strangest thing," she'd told me, "is that I'm actually grateful to David for showing me his true character before we got married. Can you imagine if I'd found out he was willing to steal and lie after we were already married? After we'd had children together? I'd been grateful too, in a way." David's actions had been devastating, but they'd also freed both Ashley and me from the illusion that he was someone he wasn't. Sometimes the truth, even when it's painful, is a gift. Robert called that evening from Denver to tell me he'd been promoted at work and was planning to use his raise to start a college fund for his twin boys. Linda called from Flagstaff to share news that she'd been selected for a leadership program that would help her become a principal. Both of my responsible children were thriving, building stable lives and planning for the future. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about how different my life looked compared to a year ago. I was still the same woman, still living in the same house, still maintaining the same routines. But everything felt different because I'd learned something crucial about myself. I was stronger than I'd believed, more capable of protecting myself than I'd imagined, and more deserving of respect than I'd been willing to demand. The stolen money was slowly being repaid through garnishment of David's prison wages, a few dollars at a time. At the current rate, it would take decades to recover the full amount, but that was okay. The money had never really been about the money. It had been about respect, trust, and the right to feel safe in my own home. A year and a half after David's sentencing, I received a letter from him. The return address was from a halfway house in Phoenix where he was completing the final months of his sentence. I stared at the envelope for a long time before deciding to open it. The letter was short and handwritten on lined paper. David's familiar script looked smaller and more careful than I remembered, as if he'd taken time to consider each word. Mom, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I know I destroyed our relationship when I stole from you and then made it worse by threatening you. I want you to know that I've been getting help here, talking to counselors about why I felt entitled to take things that weren't mine and hurt people who loved me. I'm starting to understand that my problems were never really about money. They were about my inability to accept responsibility for my own life. I don't expect you to trust me again or welcome me back into your life. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I did to you, and I'm sorry. I hope you're well and happy. David. I read the letter 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, the patterns that had characterized David's communication for so many years. Instead, I found something I'd never seen before in his words. Genuine accountability without excuses or justifications. I showed the letter to Linda and Robert, both of whom were cautiously optimistic about what it might represent. It sounds different, Linda admitted, but talk is easy. The real test will be how he behaves when he gets out. Are you going to respond? Robert asked. I thought about it for several days before deciding to write back. My letter was even shorter than his. David, I received your letter and I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. I hope your counseling continues to help you understand yourself better. I'm not ready for contact beyond this letter, but I wanted you to know that I hope you're able to build a better life for yourself. Mom. I mailed the letter and then put it out of my mind. Whatever David chose to do with his second chance was up to him. I'd done my part by holding him accountable for his actions and protecting myself from his abuse. The rest was his responsibility. 2 years after the trial, I celebrated my 75th birthday with a small party in my backyard. Linda and her daughters drove down from Flagstaff. Robert flew in from Denver with his family. Carol and several neighbors joined us for cake and conversation under the desert stars. As I looked around at the people gathered in my home, I realized that David's betrayal had inadvertently taught me something valuable about family. Real family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. It's about people who show up when you need them, who support your right to be treated with dignity, and who love you enough to help you stand up for yourself. I'd lost a son, but I'd gained something more important. I'd gained the knowledge that I was worthy of respect and capable of demanding it. I'd learned that love without boundaries isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, I sat on my back patio looking at the house Frank and I had built together. It was still my sanctuary, still my home, still the place where I felt most myself. David's attempt to take that away from me had failed. Just like his attempt to steal my financial security without consequences had failed. I was still almost 75 years old, still living alone in a house that was probably too big for one person. But I was also a woman who'd learned to fight for herself, who'd discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, and who'd built a chosen family based on love and respect, rather than obligation and guilt. David had tried to make me a victim, but I'd refused to stay one. And that, I thought as I turned off the patio lights and headed inside, was the best revenge of all. Living well, on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.